Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Do you know what it feels like to beg for help from your own parents, only to find out they spent thousands on your brother's third failed marriage instead? That single revelation shattered me in a way I didn't think was possible. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what it meant, what it said about me, about my place in their lives. It was a slap in the face, a cruel confirmation of something I'd suspected for years, but never had the courage to say out loud. I'll never forget the day I found out. It started like any other. I was juggling work and trying to recover from my medical treatments, the kind that drained your energy and your savings at the same time. The bills were piling up faster than I could pay them, and I was desperate. A few weeks before, I'd finally swallowed my pride and called my parents. Asking for help wasn't something I did lightly. I'd always try to handle my problems on my own, but this was different. My savings were gone, and I was staring down a mountain of debt that felt impossible to climb. I remember the conversation like it was yesterday. "Mom, I hate to ask, but I'm in a really tight spot right now," I said, my voice shaky with embarrassment. "I could really use some help with these medical bills. Even a loan, just something to get me through this." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for my stomach to twist into knots. "Oh, sweetheart," Mom said finally, her tone laced with pity. "You know we'd love to help, but things are tight for us two right now. The economy's been rough, and we just don't have the extra money." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I understand," I mumbled, trying to hide the lump in my throat. "Thanks anyway." When I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. I felt humiliated, like I'd just exposed a weakness I'd tried so hard to hide. But I told myself it wasn't their fault. Times were tough for everyone, right? At least that's what I thought, until the day I found the truth. A few weeks later, I was talking to my cousin Jessica. We weren't particularly close, but she had called to check in after hearing about my health struggles. The conversation was friendly at first, small talk about work, life, and family. But then she said something that made my heart stop. "Did you hear about your parents helping Matt with his divorce again? Must be nice to have that kind of support." I froze. "What are you talking about?" "Oh," Jessica said, her voice tinged with awkwardness. "I thought you knew. They helped him pay off his third settlement. Apparently, it was a pretty big chunk of change." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. My brother Matt had a long history of bad decisions. 3 marriages, 3 divorces, each one messier than the last. But this was something else entirely. I hung up with Jessica as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I dialed my parents' number. When Mom picked up, I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Did you pay for Matt's divorce settlement?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. There was a pause, just long enough for me to know the answer. "Well," she started, "he was in a tough spot, and we couldn't just let him drown. You know how hard it's been for him." "Hard for him?" I snapped. "Do you have any idea how hard it's been for me? I came to you for help, and you told me you couldn't afford it. And now you're telling me you gave him thousands of dollars for his third divorce?" "Sweetheart, it's not the same," she said, her tone shifting to that patronizing calm that made my blood boil. "You're strong. You've always been strong. But Matt, he needs us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So what? I don't need you because I'm strong? I don't deserve help because I'm not as much of a mess as he is?" "It's not about deserving," Mom said softly. "We just had to make a choice. That was it." That one sentence broke something inside me. I ended the call without saying goodbye, my heart pounding as I tried to process what had just happened. The betrayal was overwhelming, but so was the clarity. For years, I'd made excuses for them, rationalized their favoritism as unintentional or circumstantial. But now, there was no denying it. They had made a choice, and it wasn't me. Sitting there, I thought about all the times I'd put myself second for their sake, for Matt's sake. All the times I'd swallowed my own pain because I didn't want to be a burden. And this was how they repaid me. I realized something then. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep putting myself last for people who wouldn't even show up for me when it mattered most. And so, I made a choice of my own. Have you ever had to make the hardest decision of your life, knowing it would change everything? Because that was the moment I knew I couldn't go back. Growing up, I don't think I realized just how uneven the scales were in my family. It wasn't like my parents ever outright said, "Matt's our favorite." It was more subtle than that, a constant undercurrent in the way they treated us. Matt was the golden child, the one they hung all their hopes on. He was 3 years older than me and had a magnetic personality. He could charm anyone, teachers, neighbors, girls at school. Mom used to say he was destined for great things. Dad always called him a born leader. And me? Well, I was just the responsible one. At the time, I didn't mind. I was quiet and bookish, the kind of kid who preferred drawing in the corner to being the center of attention. I thought it was enough to quietly excel, to get good grades, and stay out of trouble. I figured they were proud of me in their own way. But as I got older, I started noticing the differences. Matt was always getting into trouble. Not in a malicious way, but in that reckless, impulsive way that seemed to define him. He crashed his first car within 6 months of getting his license. It wasn't even his car. It was one Dad had bought for the family, though Matt was the only one who ever drove it. When it happened, I expected Dad to be furious. But instead, he just shook his head and said, "Boys will be boys." A week later, Matt was driving a used pickup truck they'd bought him to replace the wrecked one. I remember asking Mom about it. "Why does Matt get another car? He totaled the last one." She sighed like I didn't understand some unspoken rule. "It's different for him. He needs a car for school and work. You'll understand when you're older." But I didn't understand. Not then and not now. It wasn't just the car. It was everything. When Matt dropped out of college halfway through his sophomore year, they barely blinked. He moved back home, and instead of pushing him to get back on track, they coddled him. "He's figuring things out," Mom would say whenever I asked why he wasn't looking for a job. Meanwhile, I was expected to have my act together. No one gave me a pass to figure things out. When I graduated high school, I worked part-time jobs all through college to pay for books and rent. My parents helped a little, but there was always an underlying expectation that I'd handle most of it myself. "You're so independent," they'd say, like it was a compliment. And maybe it was, but sometimes it felt more like an excuse. Like they decided I didn't need their help because I wasn't falling apart the way Matt always seemed to be. The worst part was how they refused to see the pattern, even when it was staring them in the face. Matt got married for the first time at 23. Mom and Dad paid for most of the wedding, even though I knew they couldn't really afford it. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. When it ended, they consoled him, telling him he was still so young and better off without her. A year later, he married again. This time, I didn't bother asking how much they contributed to the wedding. I already knew the answer. That marriage lasted even less time than the first. And still, they never blamed him. They never asked why he kept rushing into these relationships or why things always fell apart. They just kept bailing him out. When he got divorced for the second time, they paid for his lawyer. When his credit card debt spiraled out of control, they helped him consolidate it. When he sank all his savings into a bad business venture that went belly up, they gave him money to get back on his feet. And every time, they defend their decisions. "He's trying his best," they'd say. "He just needs a little help." By the time he got married for the third time, I was numb to it. I didn't even bother going to the wedding. I couldn't stand to watch them pour their energy and their money into another one of Matt's disasters. That decision didn't go over well. Mom called me selfish, said I wasn't being supportive of my brother. I wanted to scream, supportive? I've supported myself my whole life. Maybe it's his turn to figure things out. But I didn't say that. I just let her guilt trip me while Matt got away with being the center of their universe yet again. Looking back, it wasn't just about the money. It was about what the money represented. Every check they wrote for Matt, every time they swooped in to save him, they sent a message. He's worth saving. He's worth fighting for. And by extension, they sent another message. You'll be fine. You don't need us. But I did need them. I just didn't realize how much until it was too late. Did you ever feel like your family loved you, but not as much as they love someone else? Because that's how I felt every day of my life. And no matter how much I accomplished, no matter how hard I tried to prove myself, I always knew I'd come second. There's a moment in life when you realize just how vulnerable you are, when everything you thought was stable crumbles beneath your feet. For me, that moment came the day I got the diagnosis. It started with a dull ache in my stomach that I ignored for weeks. I chalked it up to stress or bad takeout, telling myself it was nothing to worry about. But the pain didn't go away. It got worse. By the time I finally dragged myself to the doctor, I was doubled over, barely able to stand. The diagnosis hit me like a freight train, a severe gastrointestinal condition that would require immediate surgery and a long recovery. I sat in the sterile exam room, clutching the edges of the paper-covered bed, my mind racing. How would I pay for this? My insurance covered some of it, but the out-of-pocket costs were staggering. I drained most of my savings during a layoff the year before. The numbers just didn't add up. For a few days, I tried to figure it out on my own. I spoke with billing departments, set up payment plans, even called the bank to ask about personal loans. But no matter how I sliced it, I was drowning. I hated asking for help. It felt like admitting defeat. But I didn't have a choice. So I picked up the phone and called my parents. I rehearsed what I'd say before I dialed, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. When Mom answered, I could tell she was in the middle of something. I could hear the clatter of dishes in the background and the faint hum of the TV. "Hi, sweetheart. What's going on?" she said, her voice bright and cheerful. I hesitated. "Hey, Mom, I need to talk to you about something important." Her tone shifted slightly. "Oh, is everything okay?" I swallowed hard. "Not really. I've been dealing with some health issues, and I just found out I need surgery. It's expensive. I was wondering if you and Dad could help me out. Even just a little." There was a long pause, and my stomach sank. "Oh, honey," she said finally. "You know we'd love to help, but things are tight right now. The economy's been rough, and your dad's hours have been cut. We just don't have the extra money." I felt the lump in my throat grow. "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just thought I'd ask." "Of course," she said quickly, as if trying to smooth things over. "We're so sorry, sweetheart. Is there anything else we can do? Maybe help you research payment plans, or look into charity programs?" I forced a smile, even though she couldn't see me. "No, that's okay. Thanks anyway." After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. I felt a mix of emotions: humiliation, frustration, and a deep, aching sadness. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what their refusal meant. I wasn't angry at them for not being able to help. I was angry because I'd finally reached out, put my pride aside, and asked for help, and they'd brush me off like it was nothing. But I told myself to let it go. They said money was tight. I couldn't fault them for that. A few weeks later, I found out the truth. I was on the phone with my cousin Jessica when she casually mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Your parents are so generous," she said. "It's amazing how much they've done for Matt during his divorce." I froze. "What do you mean? You didn't know?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "They helped pay off his settlement. It was a big chunk of money, too. I guess they didn't want him to lose the house." I felt the air leave my lungs. After I hung up, the pieces started falling into place. The tension in Mom's voice when I called her. The way she tried to steer the conversation away from money. The excuses. They hadn't helped me because they couldn't. They hadn't helped me because they'd chosen to help Matt instead. I felt a wave of anger, so intense it made my hands shake. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern. They'd spent years prioritizing Matt's messes, his mistakes, his bad decisions. And now, when I was at my lowest, they couldn't even be bothered to show up for me. I replayed that conversation with Mom over and over in my head. We'd love to help, but things are tight. Tight enough to say no to me, but not tight enough to say no to Matt. I thought about the times I'd been there for them, the sacrifices I'd made to stay independent so I wouldn't burden them. And for what? To be treated like a second-class child in my own family? The realization was crushing. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. Looking back, that moment was a turning point. It wasn't just about the money. It was about everything it represented: the years of favoritism, the lies, the betrayal. Have you ever been so hurt by someone you trusted that it changed the way you saw them forever? Because that's what happened to me. That's the day I stopped seeing them as my parents and started seeing them for what they really were. People who would always choose them over me. I knew I couldn't let it go. No matter how much I wanted to avoid the confrontation, no matter how many times I told myself to stay quiet and keep the peace, the betrayal sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't ignore. They had lied to me. Worse than that, they had dismissed me, tossed me aside as if I were an afterthought in my own family. And for what? So they could keep coddling Matt, keep cleaning up his messes while I struggled to keep my head above water? I couldn't do it anymore. The call happened on a Sunday afternoon. I'd been pacing my apartment for hours, rehearsing what I was going to say. When I finally dialed their number, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the ringing. Mom picked up on the third ring. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice chipper. "How are you feeling?" I ignored the question. "I need to talk to you and Dad," I said, my tone sharper than I'd intended. Her cheerful tone faltered. "Oh, okay. Is everything all right?" "No," I said bluntly. "It's not." I could hear the nervousness in her voice as she called Dad into the room. He picked up the other line, his voice steady but cautious. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath. "I know about the money," I said. "I know you helped Matt with his divorce settlement." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, Mom spoke. "Who told you that? Does it matter?" I snapped. "I know. That's all that matters." "Sweetheart, it's not what you think," she began, her tone placating. "Then what is it?" I demanded. Because from where I'm standing, It looks like you told me you couldn't afford to help with my medical bills while you were writing Matt another blank check. It's not a blank check, Dad interjected, his voice defensive. He needed our help, and I didn't? I shot back. I was facing surgery, drowning in medical debt, and you told me you couldn't afford to help me. But you could afford to bail him out of his third divorce? It's different, Mom said quietly. Different how? I asked, my voice rising. Because he screws up constantly, and I don't? Because I've spent my whole life trying to be self-sufficient while you've spent yours cleaning up his messes? Please, explain to me how that's different. Dad sighed heavily. Look, we love you both, he said, as if that answered anything. But Matt, he's not as strong as you are. He's been through a lot. We've had to step in for him more because he needs it more. I laughed bitterly. You mean he fails more? That's not the same thing as needing help. That's not fair, Mom said, her voice defensive now. You've always been so independent. You've never asked for much, and we're so proud of you for that. But Matt, he's always struggled. We had to step in. We had to make hard choices. Hard choices, I repeated, my voice shaking. You call this a hard choice? Do you have any idea what it felt like to come to you, to admit that I needed help, only to be told you couldn't do anything? Do you know how humiliating that was for me? Sweetheart, we didn't mean to hurt you, Mom said, her voice softening. Well, you did, I said flatly. The conversation spiraled from there. Every time they tried to justify their actions, I countered with years of resentment I'd bottled up for far too long. The car Matt wrecked that they replaced without hesitation. The business they bankrolled for him that failed within a year. The weddings, the divorces, the endless cycle of poor decisions they had enabled while I was left to fend for myself. You've spent your whole lives bailing him out, I said finally, my voice raw with emotion. And all it's done is teach him that he doesn't have to take responsibility for anything. Meanwhile, I've had to fight for every single thing I've accomplished because I knew I couldn't count on you. Do you even realize how unfair that is? Dad's voice was cold when he answered. Life isn't fair. No, it's not, I said, my anger boiling over. But you're my parents. You were supposed to make it fair. You were supposed to be there for me when I needed you. And you weren't. By the time I hung up, I was shaking. My hands, my voice, my entire body, it all trembled with the weight of what had just happened. I stared at my phone for a long time, wondering if they would call back, if they would try to fix what had been broken. But the phone stayed silent. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even just about Matt. This was about years of feeling like I wasn't enough. Like no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I would always be second in their eyes. And I couldn't do it anymore. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to cry, to mourn the relationship that I knew would never be the same. But another part of me felt relieved, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for their approval. I wasn't trying to prove my worth. I was standing up for myself. I didn't know what the future would look like. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back. After the confrontation with my parents, everything felt different. Quieter, colder. Like I'd stepped into an entirely new version of my life. One where the ground beneath my feet was unfamiliar and unsteady. At first, there was a strange kind of relief. For years, I'd been carrying the weight of unspoken resentment, biting my tongue, swallowing my frustration. Finally, I'd said everything I'd kept buried for so long. I put it all out there, every disappointment, every hurtful moment, and walked away with my dignity intact. But the relief didn't last. The silence was the hardest part. When I was younger, my phone would ring constantly. Mom calling to share some mundane detail about her day, Dad checking in after my college exams, Matt asking for advice he'd never actually take. Even when it annoyed me, it was comforting in its own way, a reminder that I wasn't alone. Now my phone was still. Days turned into weeks without so much as a text from any of them. I told myself it was what I wanted, what I needed, but the quiet gnawed at me in ways I hadn't expected. I find myself scrolling through old photos late at night. Family vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings. There we were, smiling in front of a tree, or crammed around the dining table with plates of turkey and stuffing. Looking at those pictures, it was hard to reconcile the warmth in those moments with the cold reality I was living now. Had it all been fake? Or had it just changed? I started noticing their absence in little ways. When I landed a big project at work, there was no one to call and share the news with. When I had a particularly rough day, I had no one to complain to who knew me well enough to understand the subtext. Holidays were especially brutal. Thanksgiving came and went, and for the first time in my life, I spent it alone. I told myself I was fine, that I didn't need turkey or pie or force conversations over a too small table. I ordered takeout and binge-watched bad TV, trying to ignore the ache in my chest. Christmas was worse. I avoided social media entirely because I couldn't bear to see the photos of smiling families, of Matt with mom and dad, all of them laughing as if I'd never existed. The isolation was suffocating. It wasn't that I didn't have friends. I did. But there's a difference between friends and family. Friends can sympathize, but they can't understand the unique pain of being estranged from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. I tried talking about it once, over drinks with my closest friend, Amanda. She listened intently, her brow furrowed as I recounted the conversation with my parents and the months of silence that followed. "That sounds awful," she said when I finished. "But don't you think you should try to patch things up? They're your family." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew she meant well, but it felt like a dismissal of everything I'd been through, everything I was still going through. "I can't," I said quietly. "It's not that simple." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't understand. How could she? Her parents adored her. She'd never had to wonder if she was enough for them. Never had to beg for scraps of their attention while her sibling got the whole feast. Some days I questioned my decision. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe I should have let it go, let them keep enabling Matt while I quietly carried on. But then I'd think about all the times I'd put myself last for their sake, all the times they'd let me down, and the anger would come rushing back. It wasn't just about the money. It was about respect, about feeling seen and valued. And they had made it abundantly clear where I stood in their hierarchy. Still, the grief lingered. Estrangement isn't a clean break. It's not a door you close and lock behind you. It's a scar that you carry with you, a constant reminder of what you've lost, or maybe what you never really had. I thought about them all the time. I wondered if they missed me, if they regretted their choices, or if they were perfectly content without me. I wondered if Matt ever thought about me, if he felt any guilt for being the center of their world while I was left on the outskirts. Over time, I started to rebuild. I focused on work, threw myself into hobbies, and tried to find fulfillment in the life I was creating for myself. Slowly, the wounds began to heal, but they never fully closed. Even now, years later, there are moments when the loss feels fresh. When I hear someone talk about their mom being their best friend, or their dad walking them down the aisle, or their siblings being their greatest allies, I feel a pang of something sharp and bitter. I tell myself I made the right decision, that I chose my own well-being over a relationship that was slowly destroying me. And most days, I believe it. But there are other days when the silence is deafening, when the weight of everything I've lost feels too heavy to bear. On those days, I wonder, was it worth it? Was I right to walk away? Or did I let my pride cost me something I can never get back? I don't know if I'll ever have an answer, but I do know this. I couldn't keep living the way I was, pretending everything was fine while they chipped away at my self-worth. So, maybe it's not about whether I was right or wrong. Maybe it's just about survival. Time has a way of softening the edges of pain, but it doesn't erase it. After I walked away from my parents, I knew I was closing a door that might never reopen. What I didn't know was how heavy the silence would be. In the years that followed, I threw myself into building a life I could be proud of. At first, it was about survival. Keeping my head above water, paying off the medical debt they couldn't be bothered to help with, and proving to myself that I could do it alone. But as time went on, it became more than that. It became about thriving, about creating something that wasn't tied to them or their validation. And I did. I got promoted at work. Twice. The first time, I walked into my boss's office expecting the usual yearly review. Instead, I left with a new title, a raise, and a team of people to manage. I'd never felt prouder in my life, but the moment was bittersweet. On my way home that evening, I instinctively reached for my phone, the way I used to when something big happened. For a split second, I forgot. I thought about calling Mom, imagining the way her voice would light up when I told her the news. Then reality hit me like a freight train. I didn't have anyone to call. I drove home in silence, the weight of the empty passenger seat pressing against me. The second promotion came a year later, and this time, I didn't even think about calling them. I celebrated quietly with a bottle of wine and a takeout meal. It wasn't the kind of celebration most people would post about on social media, but it felt right. By then, I'd learned to find pride in my own accomplishments without needing anyone else to validate them. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always enough, but it was something. Building a life without a family safety net taught me a lot about myself. I discovered strengths I didn't know I had, resilience I didn't know I was capable of. I learned how to budget down to the last dollar, how to fix leaky faucets and squeaky doors, how to take care of myself in ways I'd never had to before. But it also taught me how to keep people at a distance. Trust didn't come easily anymore. When the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally prove that their love has limits, it's hard to believe in anyone else's. Every new friendship, every budding relationship felt like walking through a minefield, waiting for the moment when they'd reveal themselves as untrustworthy. I built walls so high and so thick that sometimes even I forgot what it felt like to let someone in. I wasn't completely alone, though. Over time, I formed a small circle of friends who became my surrogate family. Amanda was one of them. Despite her earlier comment about patching things up, she didn't fully understand what I'd been through. But she tried, and that effort meant more to me than I ever told her. One Christmas, she insisted I spend the day with her family. I tried to decline. Holidays had become a sore spot for me. But she wouldn't take no for an answer. Her family was warm and welcoming, the kind of people who made you feel like you belonged even if you'd only just met them. They didn't pry, didn't ask why I wasn't spending the day with my own family. For one day, I felt like I was part of something, like I wasn't completely alone. But that night, when I got home, the emptiness crept back in. No matter how kind or loving someone else's family was, it wasn't the same. It couldn't fill the void left by the people who were supposed to be mine. I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss them sometimes. Not who they were when I left, but who they used to be. Or maybe who I thought they were. I missed the way Mom would hum while she cooked dinner. Her voice, just a little off-key. I missed Dad's terrible dad jokes, the kind that made you groan and laugh at the same time. I missed the nights when we'd all sit around the table playing cards, laughing until our stomachs hurt. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the years of favoritism, the lies, the betrayal. I couldn't go back. Not after everything. Looking back, I can see how much they shaped me, not just in the ways they hurt me, but in the ways they pushed me to grow. Their actions forced me to become fiercely independent, to build a life where I didn't rely on anyone but myself. That independence became both my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. It taught me how to survive, but it also taught me how to be lonely. I'm proud of the life I've built. I've accomplished things I never thought I could. I've created a home for myself, a career I'm passionate about, and friendships that feel genuine and real. But there's always a part of me that wonders what it would have been like if things had been different. If they'd supported me the way they supported Matt. If they'd seen me as someone worth investing in. Maybe I'd be less guarded. Maybe I'd trust more easily. Maybe I wouldn't carry this constant ache, this nagging feeling that I'm always on my own. As much as I've tried to move on, the truth is, the past doesn't stay in the past. It lingers in the quiet moments, in the milestones I celebrate alone, in the walls I've built to keep others out. It's not a perfect life, but it's mine. And for now, that's enough. It was a Wednesday when the call came, a perfectly ordinary day, one of those days where nothing notable happens until it does. I was halfway through organizing files at work when my phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen, expecting a spam call or a delivery update, but my chest tightened when I saw the name Mom. For a moment, I just stared at it. We hadn't spoken in years. Not since that final argument where I'd laid everything bare and walked away. The buzzing stopped, and I let out a shaky breath. But then it buzzed again, and again. By the third call, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Something was wrong. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Hello. There was a pause, and then her voice came through the line, quieter than I remembered. Hi, sweetheart. It's Mom. It took me a moment to respond. Hearing her call me sweetheart after all this time felt like a strange mix of comforting and infuriating. What's going on? I asked, skipping any pretense of small talk. She hesitated, then let out a shaky sigh. We need to talk. Your dad and I, we're in a bit of trouble. We met at the diner near my office. I almost canceled 3 times, but curiosity and some lingering sense of obligation pulled me there. They were already seated when I arrived, and the sight of them stopped me in my tracks. They looked older, frielier. Dad's hair was almost white, and Mom had deep lines etched into her face. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity, but then I remembered why we were here. Hi, I said as I slid into the booth across from them. Mom smiled nervously, while Dad gave me a small nod. It's so good to see you, Mom said. I didn't respond. What's this about? I asked, cutting straight to the point. They exchanged a glance, and Mom reached for her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. We're in some financial trouble, she said. Your dad's medical bills have been piling up, and with the cost of everything else, we're struggling to make ends meet. I leaned back in the booth, crossing my arms. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, my tone flat. Mom winced, and Dad cleared his throat. "We hate to ask, but we need your help," he said, "just until we can get back on our feet." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stared at them, trying to process what I was hearing. "You need my help?" I said finally, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Mom nodded. "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." I let out a hollow laugh, shaking my head. "Serious? Like when I needed help with my medical bills? Or when I was drowning in debt and couldn't see a way out? Was that not serious enough for you?" "Sweetheart, that's not fair," Mom said, her voice cracking. "No," I said, my voice rising. "What's not fair is sitting here, listening to you ask for help after everything you put me through. You told me you couldn't afford to help me, but you had plenty for Matt. Now you expect me to swoop in and save you? Do you even hear yourselves?" Dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We made mistakes," he admitted, "but we were trying to do the best we could at the time. We didn't realize how much we were hurting you." "You didn't realize?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "How could you not realize? You spent my entire life prioritizing Matt's failures over my needs. You made it perfectly clear where I stood in this family." Mom's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table toward me. "We're sorry," she said softly. "We really are. But we're your parents. Don't you think that counts for something?" I stared at her hand, but didn't take it. The conversation went in circles from there. They apologized, made excuses, tried to explain their choices. But no matter what they said, it didn't change the facts. They had chosen him. Over and over again, they had chosen him. And now, when he wasn't in a position to help them, they were turning to me as their last resort. I wanted to feel vindicated. I wanted to revel in the fact that they finally understood what it felt like to be the one left behind. But all I felt was a dull, aching sadness. I left the diner without giving them an answer. As I walked to my car, their voices echoed in my head. Mom's pleading tone, Dad's reluctant acknowledgement of their mistakes. Part of me wanted to help them, to prove to myself that I was better than they had been. But another part of me couldn't let go of the anger, the hurt, the years of being treated like an afterthought. They didn't think twice about abandoning me when I needed them most, I thought. So why should I feel guilty about doing the same? The drive home was quiet, but my mind was anything but. I replayed the conversation over and over, weighing my options. If I helped them, it wouldn't erase the past. It wouldn't make me forget the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't enough for them. But if I didn't help them, what would that say about me? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that their plea had reopened wounds I thought had healed. And once again, I was left questioning what kind of person I wanted to be. Sometimes the hardest choices aren't about what's right or wrong. They're about what you can live with. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, staring out the window at the city lights. The voices from the diner still echoed in my head. Mom's pleading, Dad's begrudging admission of their mistakes. Every word felt like a weight pressing down on me. I turned their request over and over in my mind. Should I help them? Could I help them? The logical part of me ran the numbers, considered my savings, and calculated what I could afford to spare without jeopardizing my own stability. But the emotional part of me, the part that still carried the scars of their choices, wasn't interested in logic. The truth is, I had already made my decision before I left the diner. But even now, I couldn't say it out loud. What I could do, what I had to do, was reflect on what had brought me to this point. The years of being overlooked, of being the strong one while Matt was allowed to crumble. The countless times I had put myself last because I didn't want to add to their burden, only to find out that they'd always prioritized him anyway. I thought about loyalty, how it had been drilled into me from the time I was a child. Family comes first. Blood is thicker than water. These were the mantras I'd grown up hearing, the unspoken rules that had shaped my worldview. But somewhere along the way, I'd learned a different lesson. That loyalty wasn't a one-way street. That it wasn't enough to give and give while receiving nothing in return. Did loyalty mean I owed them something now, after all they'd done, or failed to do? Justice was another word that weighed heavily on my mind. For years, I had fantasized about a moment like this, a moment when they would need me and I could finally confront them with everything they'd put me through. And now that it was here, it didn't feel the way I thought it would. There was no satisfaction in seeing them vulnerable, no triumph in holding the power they had once wielded over me. If anything, it felt hollow. Justice was supposed to be fair, balanced. But nothing about this situation felt fair. Helping them wouldn't undo the past, and refusing them wouldn't erase the pain they'd caused. Then there was self-worth. For so long, I had let my sense of worth be defined by them. by their approval, their praise, their willingness or unwillingness to support me. And when they failed me, I took that failure as a reflection of my own inadequacy. But over the years, I had learned to define my own worth. I had built a life for myself without their help, carved out a space where I could stand on my own 2 feet. Helping them now felt like a threat to that hard-won independence. It felt like opening the door to a past I had worked so hard to leave behind. But at the same time, wasn't part of self-worth about knowing who you are and what you stand for? If I turned my back on them completely, would I still be the person I wanted to be? These were the questions I wrestled with as the night stretched on. What do we owe the people who hurt us? Is forgiveness something you give freely or something you earn? Does doing the right thing always feel right? I didn't have the answers. Maybe I never would, but I did know this. Whatever choice I made, it wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, about the kind of life I wanted to live, the kind of person I wanted to be. The next morning, I woke up early, the weight of the decision still heavy on my chest. I sat down at my desk with a pen and paper and began to write. A letter, a check, or nothing at all. I won't say which. All I'll say is that as I sealed the envelope, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something close to it. A quiet certainty that I had made the best decision I could with the hand I'd been dealt. Walking to the mailbox, I thought about everything I had learned over the years. About loyalty and how it's earned, not demanded. About justice and how it's rarely as clean or satisfying as we want it to be. About self-worth and how it's something we have to fight for, even when it feels like the world is trying to take it from us. When I let the envelope slip through the slot, I felt lighter. Not because I was sure I'd done the right thing, because honestly, I wasn't sure at all, but because I'd made a choice. Life isn't fair. Families aren't perfect. And sometimes there are no right answers, only the ones you can live with. Maybe I did the right thing. Maybe I didn't. But at the end of the day, I made my choice. What would you have done?